Welcome to Book Talk. Winston Churchill has a pretty solid claim to be considered the greatest ever British leader, perhaps even the greatest ever Brit. But in his early career as a rising star of Edwardian politics, he was often dismissed as an untrustworthy, erratic, dangerous political show-off, so disliked by his colleagues that on one occasion they even walked out when he rose to speak in the Commons. Now, almost any full-scale Churchill biography is bound to be dominated by his wilderness years, when he warned against the rising Nazi threat, and then by his wartime leadership when Britain stood alone. But my guest today, the author Michael Shelden, has produced an interestingly different view of the great man by focusing on that early career as an up-and-coming Edwardian statesman. So, Michael, what do we learn about Churchill when you focus on that bit of his life and don't look at the moment of greatness, as it were, later on?
Well, I think actually it's amazing that he seems fully formed almost from the moment he walks into the Commons in 1901. He's got much of the same personality. In fact, I came to believe in even stronger personality, much more forceful, if you can believe it. We always think of the older Churchill as being an incredible personal magnetic force, but I think that was equally true, and perhaps even more true, of the young man who was full of ambition, knew what he wanted to achieve. Many people thought he would be Prime Minister before he was 40. He certainly had that kind of attitude.
And so, are you saying that a long exposure to politics perhaps polished off some of the rougher edges, possibly even dulled the ambition?
I think failure was the crucial thing, because he has this meteoric rise through the ranks. He goes from being a junior minister at the Colonial Office to being, the head of the Admiralty. And that happens within a space of a little more than half a dozen years. So it's an amazing rise, but it all collapses around 1915 when the early reversals in the war are put at Churchill's feet. And that early failure in his life, I think, conditioned him to accept the fact that he would have a long struggle. By the time he becomes Prime Minister in his 60s, he's ready for the office, but he's a slightly dimmer figure, I think, dimmer in the sense of not being so stellar as he was as a young man.
Paint us a picture of the political world he entered. There's a sense of, this is the climax of empire, a third of the globe is British pink, and the empire is being run from around a few exclusive dinner tables.
The Edwardian period is very interesting as far as politics go, because it certainly has a kind of forcefulness behind all of it, because there is the sense that London's the center of the world, as it was. But I think also politics was a lot rowdier, angrier at that time, if you can believe it. If you consider the fact that Churchill, at one point, is physically attacked in the Commons, a book, the Speaker's Book of Orders, is thrown at him by one of Edward Carson's followers in a heated debate over Northern Ireland. And it draws blood. And it's a shocking moment, because Churchill, who's he's just under 5'8", he begins to charge the fellow who threw the book and fight him. The man who threw the book was 6'6". So he was the bulldog even in that time of his life.
You almost imagine the Edwardian era, they're practically wearing togas. It's all very solemn and dignified, and actually it doesn't seem to be like that at all reading the book. As you say, there are quite a number of nasty, riotous moments that punctuate his career.
And people walking out on other people in the Commons, shouting them down, and really quite violent episodes in politics. People were put at risk when they were out discussing their various programs in the streets and in the various elections. The suffragettes were a mighty force at the time, and weren't afraid to attack politicians personally with anything at hand.
So Churchill arrives with a political pedigree. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, who had been Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Victorian era, whose career rather petered out after a series of misjudgments, but who nonetheless was quite a figure and was well remembered when Churchill first makes his debut.
Yes, and I think his father's experience haunted him, because his father also had that experience of early failure but didn't recover from it. When his career collapsed around the age of 40, strangely enough, as Churchill's would, he then went into a slow decline and died while he was still in his 40s. I think Churchill, when he encountered his own failure in 1915, really was haunted by the thought that he was repeating a kind of family tragedy. But you can't deny the fact that being Lord Randolph's son, and also coming from Blenheim, that there was a sense of destiny there. And he has that. He says when he escaped from the Boers in the South African War, he has this lovely phrase where he says, "The stars in their courses guided me." And he feels that there's some sort of revolving force in the universe that's pushing him along.
And one of the powers and abilities that Churchill seemed to bring to politics was to be a phrase maker.
Yes.
There's a sense that the rhetoric rolls off his tongue. And was this a natural phenomenon or something he had to study and learn how to do? Because it's an incredibly rare ability even now.
He did study. He studied very, very closely. He studied other politicians' speeches. He took an almost, as though learning on the job was his university. And he would watch how other people gave their speeches and listen carefully to their modulations and their rhetoric. He said early on, "I believe in personality." And I think no matter how much study he did, it was still a matter of what he would personally bring through his own magnetic force of character to his career. And he had that faith in himself, which I don't think you can fake. That shows. So the personality that was forming, that almost seemed fully formed at that early age, was part of the appeal.
Now, the Conservative Party Churchill joined was beginning to have a serious ideological split. The idea of having empire free trade, where the British Empire essentially traded with itself behind a tariff barriers keeping other people's exports out, or just having free trade. Free trade meant cheaper food for the working classes, and that was what Churchill was in favour of and what his party was moving away from. And he ended up switching sides.
Churchill is surprisingly liberal in this period, and many people have attributed that to a sense of opportunism. There's no denying that, but he also very much felt at this early age that this was the better way to go. He really puts together much of the national insurance plan that Lloyd George later gets credit for, and he rises quickly through the liberal ranks in part because he makes a very convincing liberal at this time. It wasn't a matter of simply trying to pretend that he had these sympathies. He really did.
But changing political parties, and he just walks into the Commons one day and sits on the opposition side, changing political parties in the way you describe wasn't just a matter of sitting on a different side of a chamber. You exchange almost one social set for another. You move into a quite different social world as well.
He earned friends, but he also earned undying enemies because they regarded him on the Conservative side as being a traitor. And the farther he went up the ranks in the Liberal side, the more the Tories hated him. And they hated him because they hated to see him profit from that decision to leave their ranks. It rankled all the time.
But the split Tories lose an election. The Liberals, after quite a long time in the wilderness, come into government, and Churchill comes into government. He's quite early on seems to have been spotted as a rising star and fast-tracked to promotion, and he's an uncomfortable junior colleague for Lord Elgin, the Colonial Secretary, to have.
Elgin would become so annoyed with him because Churchill would take his various memoranda and he would write on it, "I don't agree," or "I can't do this." And Elgin would write back, "I can." And just try to, it was a sort of back and forth between these two, a real test of wills. And I think I say in the book that only Churchill could work for an earl and still think he was the boss.
But you have a rather interesting contrast perhaps to the modern era, because Churchill was a nonconformist, a difficult figure. But he was also someone who had original thoughts and ideas and force and personality and speaking ability and all these things. And so a bit of nonconformism didn't stop a pretty fast rise to cabinet rank.
No, and he also had this belief that others would talk, he wanted to get things done. And he had that attitude right away, that he wanted to accomplish things. He didn't simply want to achieve office without having a record of some prominence that he could feel good about. So when he gets in, for example, to the Admiralty, he races through the Admiralty looking for the best people, trying to set things up for the future war that he sees coming with Germany, beginning to build these enormous battleships, the dreadnoughts, and turn them out in great numbers because he feels, just as he did before the Second World War, that there's a threat coming and Britain needs to be prepared for it.
But while all this is going on and while he's rising through the ranks, there's a surprisingly tortured emotional life going on in the background. I mean, the Churchill legend is almost that there was never really any woman for him except his wife, the American heiress Clementine Hoosier. And then that turns out not to quite be the case, as you reveal.
No, in fact, what I think he wanted with his career was a consort. He wanted someone who would be, if he saw himself almost in princely terms as a young Titan, he wanted a woman who would fill the role next to him and would also be equally dramatic and spectacular and wonderful. I think he found that in Clementine, but he was looking on such a high level. Some of the women that he proposed to before were in fact theatrical, like the actress Ethel Barrymore, or Muriel Wilson, who was one of the richest women in Britain at the time, but she also was fond of appearing in amateur theatricals. So you see this theme running through, that he wants a woman who can stand on the world stage with him because he assumes he will be on that world stage.
So he's looking for a consort as he rises. And just before the First World War, he's an incredibly belligerent figure in British politics. I mean, it tends to be forgotten now that there was certainly a threat of civil war in Ireland and possibly a threat of civil war in Britain, and a lot of very, very high-temperature rhetoric floating around. And Churchill was one of the people speaking some of the hardest words.
I found this strange moment in my research where the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is in London a few months before he's assassinated, and he's going shopping at Harrods. And he seems like such an ordinary man. He leaves his hotel, wanders down to Harrods and shopping. And I say in the book, if anyone had suggested this man in a few months would start a cataclysm, they would have been laughed at.
He gets murdered and World War I resolves.
And World War I starts. Churchill is already thinking ahead to that moment. He's already thinking, what will it take for Britain to survive the Armageddon that's coming? And he uses that word, other people use that word at the time. So he sees the world as coming apart, both because of the nationalist sympathies in Ireland, but also because of the rise of Germany. And he is equally determined to make sure the result is good for Britain, as he will be 25 years later.
The war breaks out. We have Winston Churchill as the First Lord of the Admiralty, which is a cabinet-level post because the British Navy at that point was so vast. It's like being in charge of, I don't know, the US nuclear deterrent or something now, perhaps. He's in charge of one of the most powerful military forces on the planet, so he's obviously a key player from the moment it starts. But you get this bizarre moment where he threatens to resign it all, go away and lead the defence of the Belgian city of Antwerp from the invading Germans, which the Prime Minister is actually quite indulgent about and sort of chuckles indulgently and said, no, you can't do that. That extraordinary romantic streak reveals itself at that moment.
I have suggested in talks I've given about the book, imagine if Donald Rumsfeld during the Iraq War suddenly left the Secretary of Defense and the next thing you heard, he was leading a platoon in Iraq. It's that sort of thing. Churchill was on the battlefield, under fire. He couldn't resist that. The bugle note of history, someone said, always was in his ears. So he felt, given his family history, that he should be somewhere leading the troops into battle, and he couldn't resist it.
But he continues famously to run the Admiralty for quite a while, and falls out with his #1 military subordinate, the Admiral Jackie Fisher, this terrifying, rather elderly, very set in his ways head of the Navy.
Yes, Jackie Fisher's an amazing character because he's an old, crusty admiral who's brilliant at times, but almost bordering on insanity at other times. And Churchill trusts him almost completely. And when the Dardanelles fiasco takes place, Churchill gets the blame for it, and Jackie walks away. Jackie pretends he had nothing to do with it, and in fact it was in large part his idea at the beginning. So Churchill is left completely out on a limb as a result of that, and it's a total disaster. And at the time, no one thought Churchill could revive his career after that disaster. It looked so bad for him.
Yes, this is the Gallipoli campaign where there was an attempt to end the First World War quickly by defeating Turkey in a sort of master stroke, which really didn't work and ended pretty horribly. Now, Churchill's, as you say, gets the blame for that, and not just content to sit on the backbenches for a while, he goes to war.
He does indeed, and he does it because he feels this was a battle that he helped to get the country into, because he thought it was necessary, and that he couldn't simply stand on the sidelines after he's kicked out of the government, rather unceremoniously. He feels that he has to prove